Welcome to the debate. Today we're diving into a really complex area, the analysis of the defense strategy used by the Ramsey family after the tragic event involving their daughter. It really remains one of the most, I'd say, intellectually frustrating and persistent cases in modern forensic history.
Absolutely. And the court issue we're really grappling with here, I think, is the family's consistent pattern of behavior, specifically their reliance on faith, these unwavering claims of innocence, and importantly, their accusations of investigative bias. We have to ask, are these patterns the genuine, stress-distorted psychological reactions of innocent people under just catastrophic scrutiny?
Right. And this is the crucial distinction. Do these behaviors actually function, whether they intended it consciously or not, as a sophisticated, almost obstructive strategy? That's really the tension. My position is that these actions are primarily manifestations of a deep, possibly quite genuine psychological integration of identity and innocence. It's driven, profoundly, I think, by trauma and a sincere, if perhaps self-deceiving, belief.
And I approach it from a slightly different angle. My argument is that these behaviors function foremost as sophisticated techniques, logical, forensic, and social obstruction techniques. Techniques that effectively prevent accountability, prevent truth discovery, really regardless of what the family's internal subjective conviction might actually be. We have to look at the functional outcome.
Okay, well, let's start with the faith aspect. When we look at the use of religious framing in a high-stakes investigation like this, we're dealing with something, extraordinarily powerful. It's well documented, actually, in the literature on denial and self-justification. Invoking spiritual conviction fundamentally moves the entire narrative, doesn't it? It sort of transforms a police procedural, which is governed by fallible evidence, into more of a moral drama governed by absolute, unshakable faith. And Patsy Ramsey's statement here is absolutely key, I think. I don't give a darn how scientific it is. I didn't do it. This just perfectly encapsulates what some experts call belief superiority, that gut conviction that your internal certainty, your feeling, is simply superior to any piece of external, objective evidence. For people like the Ramseys, it seems their innocence and their religious identity became psychologically fused. So if the police even suggest guilt, it's not just an attack on their legal standing, it's perceived as an attack on their entire moral identity as good people. And that becomes an existentially impossible scenario for them to accept.
Okay, that fusion of identity and innocence, I'll grant you that. It's clearly powerful. But we have to analyze the logic here. The invocation of religious faith within the context of a criminal inquiry represents, in my view, a profound category error.
A category error? How so?
Yes, it's mixing two fundamentally different categories of truth. Moral or spiritual truth is, generally speaking, unfalsifiable. You can genuinely believe something with all your heart, but that belief doesn't make it factually accurate in the real world. Factual truth, especially in a legal setting, must be verifiable, testable against evidence. By introducing God, spiritual oaths, divine judgment, they strategically shift the burden of proof. So instead of meeting the legal standard, countering evidence, demonstrating innocence beyond a reasonable doubt, the standard subtly morphs into something like, who are you to question my solemn oath before God? It makes skepticism, even professional skepticism from investigators, feel like an assault on faith itself. And that's a highly effective way to manage the social narrative to control public perception. Look, from a purely forensic criminology perspective, this functions as a textbook obstruction technique. Maybe not consciously planned in every instance, but functionally, yes. Investigators need subjects to engage with the actual evidence, the facts on the ground. Religious assertion often short-circuits this process entirely. When a suspect shifts the conversation into this unfalsifiable spiritual territory, forensic tools, DNA, timelines, logic, they just become almost irrelevant to that part of the conversation. And here's the critical point for me. Whether they strategically employed this or whether it just emerged organically from deeply sincere belief, the forensic effect is identical. The investigation stalls. Progress becomes incredibly difficult.
I
I see the power of framing it that way, the forensic obstruction argument. But I still think we might be overlooking the sheer force of the psychological drivers that make this kind of defense almost inevitable for certain people under extreme duress. Consider the physiological side for a moment. When someone invokes God or their deeply held faith during a moment of intense stress, that conviction can actually engage the body's calming mechanisms, the parasympathetic nervous system. It's a way the mind tries to regulate overwhelming emotion. And that composed certainty you sometimes see, that deep, self-assured belief, it can produce physical signatures that look like truth-telling on, say, a polygraph or just in demeanor. Why? Because they genuinely believe their own innocence, or at least the narrative of innocence they've constructed. Their bodies are mirroring their absolute internal conviction. And that deeply complicates any external attempt to assess deception based purely on physiological cues.
That's a fascinating point regarding the body's response to deeply held conviction. I agree. But let's press on the functional outcome again, particularly concerning their selective cooperation. If their faith is this absolute, this guiding principle, why does their willingness to engage with investigators seem to only activate when those investigators agree with their narrative? This brings us squarely to the issue of what I'd call selective sanctification. The pattern seems pretty clear if you look at the source material. Cooperation, interviews, even expressions of religious kinship. These became possible, really only possible, when investigators, most notably Detective Lou Smit, fully embraced their intruder theory. Smit aligned with their narrative, he shared their framing of the events, and suddenly he became the trusted ally, the good investigator.
Defensive psychology operating under just unbearable stress. It looks very much like a defense mechanism known as splitting.
Explain that simply for us. What exactly is splitting in this context?
Well, splitting is basically a primitive psychological defense. Under catastrophic trauma, the mind sometimes struggles to hold complex, ambiguous views of others, so it simplifies. It divides everyone into two starkly opposing camps. The all-good, completely trustworthy allies, like Smit in this case, who validates their core identity as victims, and then the all-bad, threatening enemies, like the skeptical police officers who challenge that identity. It simplifies a terrifyingly complex and threatening situation, which allows the person to conserve psychological energy, just to function, just to get through the day. It's actually a recognized response pattern in traumatized subjects who are in essence just trying to survive the ordeal psychologically.
But again, let's look past the potential intent or psychological mechanism and focus squarely on the consequences, the forensic reality. Psychologically, maybe it's splitting. Fine. Forensically, though, it functions as instrumental religiosity. They appear to be using their faith, their social standing, their cultural capital to achieve fundamentally secular goals, building strategic alliances, shoring up community support, and critically, creating division within the investigative ranks. And the result was immediate and damaging, a lack of investigative unity. Smith's cooperation with the Ramseys, which was sort of sanctified by their shared alignment on the intruder theory, provided a massive forensic advantage to the defense. It practically guaranteed perpetual ambiguity. It sowed reasonable doubt, simply because law enforcement wasn't speaking with one unified voice anymore. That division itself became a powerful defense mechanism, facilitated directly by this selective cooperation.
Okay, this leads us naturally, I think, to their persistent claim of police hostility. They maintained, quite strongly, that the police were biased against them, even ill-intended, right from the very beginning. Now, I agree the objective record often shows what looks like standard, if sometimes imperfect, investigative procedure, not necessarily outright malice. But let's try to look at this purely from their subjective reality, their lived experience of catastrophic loss and sudden suspicion. It's plausible that their threat detection system went into overdrive. This is where a concept like hostile attribution bias might come into play. Under that kind of extreme stress, the brain can start interpreting ambiguous signals, like professional skepticism or standard investigative questions, as direct personal attacks. They genuinely feel persecuted, even if an outside observer sees something different.
But the issue isn't just whether they feel persecuted, is it? It's what they do with that feeling, how it's leveraged.
Exactly. And once they perceive that threat, rightly or wrongly, Every subsequent interaction gets filtered through that lens. And there's potentially a powerful physiological feedback loop at work here, too. The perception of threat, even if it's mistaken, triggers a real physiological stress response. Their body produces cortisol, their muscles tense up, their heart rate increases, their body's experiencing real suffering, and it then interprets this physical suffering as confirmation that the persecution is real, that the threat is external and valid. This can make their belief in being victimized almost unshakable, because their suffering feels so physically grounded, regardless of the objective accuracy of the narrative they've built around it.
I remain skeptical of interpreting that purely as a reactive psychological phenomenon, particularly because that claim of hostility, which I tend to think of as convenient hostility, is essentially an unfalsifiable assertion. Logically, the claim is constructed in a way that it survives regardless of the evidence presented. If the police are hostile or make mistakes, well, the Ramseys are proven right. If the police act professionally and by the book, the Ramseys can still claim, well, they're just hiding their true intentions. They're putting on a show. It functions as a kind of rhetorical shield that deflects any critique. Now, if we analyze this from the perspective of, say, understanding a potential criminal mindset, not saying that's what it is, but analyzing it through that lens, this looks like a sophisticated form of preemptive reframing. It's a strategy deployed early on to manage the narrative, and it accomplishes several key strategic objectives all at once. First, it serves to discredit any damaging evidence that might emerge later by claiming the source, the police, is inherently biased. Second, it perfectly justifies limiting cooperation. I mean, why would you talk openly to people who've supposedly already decided you're guilty? Third, it generates enormous public sympathy. The image of a grieving family being persecuted by overzealous cops is powerful. And finally, it directly injects reasonable doubt into the minds of any potential juror down the line. And we also, I think, have to acknowledge the anthropological or sociological angle here. The Ramseys possess significant social, economic, and cultural capital. This status, this privilege, allow them to successfully leverage their narrative of persecution into substantial media sympathy and strong community protection. That's frankly a privilege not afforded equally to every suspect in the criminal justice system. This illustrates how the pursuit of justice can sometimes be culturally contingent, mediated by social status, and that access to resources and influence is, in itself, a powerful forensic advantage.
That structural critique is fair. It's definitely part of the picture. But it forces us back, I think, to the ultimate question of meaning here. What kind of certainty are they actually asserting when they claim innocence with such conviction? This brings us right to the core ambiguity, the thing that makes this case so endlessly debated.
Agreed. And this is the haunting conclusion, isn't it? The defense patterns we've just spent time meticulously analyzing, the intense religious conviction, the sustained emotional certainty, the narrative consistency over years, these are precisely the qualities that any sophisticated defense strategy, whether consciously devised or emerging unconsciously from denial, would aim to cultivate. It feels like the family has constructed a kind of fortress of faith, a psychological fortress that is seemingly impenetrable by external evidence, by logical counterargument, or even by standard interrogation techniques.
I have to concede that point. The observable behavioral pattern itself doesn't reliably distinguish between genuine, traumatized innocence and a sophisticated, perhaps guilt-driven defense. That's the lasting tragedy here. But we must consider the philosophical dilemma this presents, particularly the difference between two types of truth. There's what philosophers call correspondence truth, where our claims, our beliefs, must match objective external reality. They must correspond to the facts. And then there's coherence truth, where claims are considered true if they fit perfectly and consistently within one's own internal system of beliefs, regardless of external evidence. It seems the Ramseys operate almost entirely on coherence. Their innocence is self-evident to them. It's a foundational truth upon which their entire identity appears to be built, irrespective of, or perhaps insulated from, contradictory forensic facts or logical inconsistencies pointed out by others. The ultimate, perhaps unanswerable, question for us becomes, can we accept that this identity-level certainty is subjectively genuine for them, even though it actively defies or perhaps obstructs the search for external objective proof.
And that right there is the fundamental problem from an investigative standpoint. It's an assertion of internal self-knowledge that functionally makes objective investigation nearly impossible. It creates an impasse.
So, to summarize my perspective, I believe the powerful psychological and perhaps even physiological mechanisms we've discussed suggest that the observed sincerity and sustained conviction are likely reflections of a deeply integrated internal reality for the Ramseys. Trauma, denial, the profound need to maintain self-integrity, these forces could have led to a state where, for them, innocence became utterly indistinguishable from their core identity.
And I would reiterate my position. While their subjective belief may indeed be sincere, we can't truly know the heart of another. The undeniable functional result of their consistent strategy has been obstruction. Using faith as a defensive shield, selectively cooperating only with those who validated their narrative, and consistently reframing professional scrutiny as persecution, all this created an environment of ultimate unfalsifiability. It effectively stalled investigative resolution for decades, leaving key questions unanswered.
It highlights the lasting dilemma of this case, doesn't it? Faith becomes either the ultimate expression of truth for them or the ultimate hiding place.
Exactly. And the case remains perpetually haunted by the deeply unsettling fact that both possibilities, traumatized innocence or sophisticated defense, can produce nearly identical observable patterns. It leaves the core question of motive, of meaning, fundamentally unresolved for the investigation and, indeed, for all of us watching.